Hey, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at the interventionist strategies and understanding what they are in a more in-depth manner. All right, first of all, what do we mean by this? And this is, if you saw the introductory video, I went through this slide in that, and if so, you can just kind of move on to the next slide if you want. But if you didn't, what are interventionist strategies? Well, this is where the government takes an active role in the economy by manipulating it, right? It's the government getting involved. It's just like your parents getting involved in your life. The government gets involved because it feels like it needs to in order to inhibit or not inhibit in order to enhance the lives of its people. And examples of this that we've seen throughout the development section of the syllabus is import substitution, protectionist trade policies, exchange rate intervention, regulations, nationalization of industries, and government involvement in the export market. And these things are really key to understanding the ideas or the logic behind interventionist strategies. If you're going to do an evaluation on this, you must know what these are and you must know that they have benefits. Okay, so take a look at that. Know these. Be comfortable with these. And the good thing about knowing these is that if you know what these are and you can imagine what the opposite of these things are, then you understand what the market-led strategies are. Okay, but let's look at it a little bit more in-depthly. Okay, so interventionist strategies were the way, they were the trend for the first 30 years after World War II. So that's roughly 1945, right, to the 1980s. And the main emphasis was on government planning. And so the idea was that really, if you think about it, Europe had to socialize in a lot of ways. The government had to, in Europe, governments in Europe had to intervene in a lot just for Europe to get its feet back underneath it again, right? But then slowly, after those 30 years, even in the United Kingdom, there was this sort of backlash to this government intervention, and you see like Margaret Thatcher emerge, and these really supply-sided, market-led philosophies dominating the day. Well, you can imagine that the same thing's going to be mirrored in the developing world, right? Because these trends tend to be reflective in both the developed and developing world. So the thing was that there were no real examples of sustained growth and development from the countries involved where there was pure government planning. In other words, the interventionist strategies really sort of ran out of gas by the time they got to the 1980s. And here were some problems that arose. The first thing is that the public sectors grew too large, right? And when the public sector is too large, you have things like bureaucratic inefficiency, overstaffing, and you combine that with political instability, and it just is like the perfect recipe for corruption, and corruption is bad for economic development and growth. The second thing is that there was this growing political instability. I just mentioned that. Political instability. The other thing is that nationalized industries, of which there were many, tended to be inefficient and thus not profit making. And this led to increased and high levels of hidden unemployment. The other thing is that during this time period, government spending tended to be ridiculous, excessive, leading to large budget deficits and thus the need for borrowing and for increasing the money supply. And if you increase the money supply, this leads to high rates of inflation. High rates of inflation means that the living standards of your country are slowly losing their value because the money they have in their savings accounts are losing their value. And then the last thing is that much of the expenditure of governments was on large infrastructure projects, which had little success. And so by the 1980s, there was this movement towards free markets and supply-side oriented governments in developed countries, especially in the United States under Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, that saw the shift of emphasis in government policy in developed countries and a change of direction in the thinking of the best way to achieve growth and development in developing countries. This also ties into, if you think back to the other videos and your just general knowledge, the third world debt crisis. Like the very time that the third world debt crisis took place, you see the emergence of these conservative governments, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, which, of course, if they are the powerful countries of the world, which they were, they're going to have a really massive impact in developing nations and pushing them towards free markets. And that's what happens. All right, so check out the next video, which is on the market-led strategies for economic development. I hope you thought this video was helpful, and we'll talk to you in a bit.